Good afternoon, everyone. And as Sally mentioned, this is day 4 of the HousingLIN's virtual summit of Festival Ideas. And I can't believe we're already into the 8th session. We've got a great lineup for you, and I shall introduce George shortly, who's going to be chairing this afternoon's session. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeremy Porteous. I'm the founder and the chief exec of the Housing Learning and Improvement Network, or HousingLIN for short. We've got a fabulous week of events for you. And we're delighted that we could be joined by so many expert speakers. We've got over 40 speakers and indeed over 600 people who've registered to join us during the week. That has resulted in about 2,500 streams, and those will be both live streams from those of you who joined us today, but a large number of people who then watch at their own leisure at another time. As Sally mentioned, do please use the X or Twitter handle and the hashtag HLIN Summit 24 to share your views and post any thoughts and comments on what the speakers are saying. We do encourage people to use social media. And also, if you still have access to our microsite, have a look at what all the speakers, who all the speakers are. And I know George is going to introduce them, but we got a little bit more information about everyone there. This year's summit is the 4th virtual summit that we've held since really the pandemic. But it's the 12th annual conference in total since we became independent of government. Formerly responsible for the Department of Health's Extra Care Housing Fund. In fact, while John Rouse, one of our speakers, was Director General at the Department of Health at the time, we continued to support policy implementation and over the last decade have worked very closely with academics, policymakers and practitioners to really championing the housing and care and support needs of an ageing population. From happy really to tappy, we're taking into account the technology-enabled care as well. Before I sort of commence with the session and pass over to George, just a few words about our sponsors. We're really grateful to the UKRI Healthy Ageing Challenge and George and the team in particular for being a headline sponsor of this event, along with Guinness, Inspire Villages and Tunstall, and a whole host of associate sponsors have all contributed to make this session and the summit over the week possible. It not only supports us for this virtual summit, but also ensures that all our activities over the course of the year remain free of charge to all our 20,000 members. So thank you very much for your continued support, and also for those members for supporting us in being able to put on some high quality programs like today. Now, as for the program itself today, the session is called Crafting a Vision to Transform Our Future Homes, and I'm delighted that George McGuinness, Director of the UKRI's Healthy Ageing Challenge, and somebody who I've known for a long time, from building telecare in England at the Department of Health right through to Dallas and others, but Healthy Ageing Challenge has been a really important program. I had the privilege to be on the advisory board chaired by Helena Herklotz, the Older Persons Commission. But George, your vision was really great, and we're going to use that vision to help explore transforming our future homes today. So over to you, George.
Jeremy, I feel very humbled and really delighted to be part of this Festival of Ideas. I think HousingLIN have been so important in shaping thinking in this area for so long. I've really enjoyed seeing some of the earlier sessions this week. So I know we've got a lot to live up to, but we've got a great line of speakers to do just that. Before I sort of launch in, I'd just say that housing has been such an important part of what we've been doing in the Healthy Ageing Challenge, and that work has ranged from new designs through to modifying existing stock, from simple adaptations through to major works, right up to embedding designs and innovations in a major new development. So absolutely core to what we've been doing. On the way, delighted to have had Jeremy on board. Actually, interestingly, both Jeremy and our research director, Judith Phillips, are on the Older Persons Housing Task Force, as is our first speaker, John Rouse. So the significance of this work is reflected in that. Before we launch in, again, I'd like to say in crafting a vision to transform our future homes, I'd like us to stretch our thinking beyond the very rational aspects of planning and also think about the emotional implications of the choices that people are going to make. The desire to age in place, or at least be able to connect with their communities. The life stage and timing of any move and the appropriateness of the different options that are available. And the value of actually being able to bring generations together, particularly at a place level. So with that in mind, I'm delighted to be able to introduce the first of our 4 perspectives today, John Rouse. John is City Director and Head of Paid Service for Stoke-on-Trent City Council. Actually, he brings a wealth of experience in both health and housing. And to give you a brief flavour of that, he has an honorary doctorate in urban design and is an honorary member of the Royal Institute for British Architects and the Town Planning Institute. In health, he is a board member of the Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent ICB, where he is currently Executive Champion for Children's Health, having previously led on older people. And actually, if you look at his CV, there's a wealth of other experience, including his work in the Department of Health. So, John, over to you to get us started.
Thanks very much. And as if by magic, my slides appear. Well, it's an absolute privilege to be able to present to you and share this webinar with my fellow panel members this afternoon on what is an absolutely critical topic. And it was also a privilege over a year ago now to be invited to be part of the government's Older People's Housing Task Force. And we've now been working for almost a year on the task of understanding what needs to change to ensure that we get sufficient quantities and quality of older people's housing to meet all sorts of different needs well into the future. We're at a particular junction in terms of the task force work at the moment, because we're probably just 2-3 months away from actually finalising our report and subject to ministerial agreement to publish that report. So I'm going to tell you about our journey as a task force and where we've reached. What I can't do this afternoon is to give you the final recommendations, because that would not be right. It would be preemptive, and they are still iterating at this stage of the process. But I think I'm going to give you enough clues that you'll be able to see where the task force is heading and where we're likely to land. I should probably also just say that I have run these slides past the chair of the task force as a matter of courtesy. So she might not know exactly what I'm going to say, but she has a fair idea of what I'm going to share with you this afternoon. I think it's worth saying, in terms of the task force's mission, we're particularly focused on lower to middle incomes. So we're not particularly, focused on those with high incomes who, frankly, will find a way of meeting their own needs in terms of the choice of general needs and specialist housing that is on offer. It is the middle market and the affordable market where we believe that we've got a problem, and quite a serious problem, as I will show you, in terms of how much specialist older people's housing we are building or not building at the current time. And my task this afternoon is to talk to you about one aspect of the task force's work in particular, which is how the planning system is not working in the interests of older people and older people's housing at the present time, and what we might need to do about that if we're going to be successful as a country in developing a housing stock which is fit for purpose in terms of an ageing population in the future. Next slide. So over the course of the last 10 months, we have been far and wide as a task force. It's a really great group of people, highly eclectic in terms of specialisms and perspectives, and it has been an absolute pleasure to learn from them, as well as to feed in my own expertise and experience over the years. And one of the things we've done is we visited a lot of schemes and a lot of places, not just in terms of this country, but also abroad as well. Just very, very recently, part of the task force were in the Netherlands to understand how they're going about the same challenge in terms of their housing stock into the future. I think it's also worth saying that we have engaged incredibly extensively with all of the stakeholder interests and groups through the process of the task force. We've had surveys, we've had roundtables, we've had hundreds of bilateral and trilateral meetings. We've had a general call for evidence and had significant responses to that. We've undertaken our own primary research in particular areas where we didn't think there was a proper understanding. One of those actually was to really trawl the data in terms of how the planning system is functioning or not, as the case may be. And I'll share a little bit of that data with you in a few minutes' time. I should say, because I'm going to focus on the deficit to some extent this afternoon, we have visited some places that actually made our hearts skip a beat, in that they really are doing some fantastic work in this area. Places like North Yorkshire and Central Bedfordshire and Sunderland, who really have integrated the different parts of the system to make great strides in terms of increasing both the quantity and quality of their provision over the last decade. We can learn from them and from other places. Next slide. So in the first part of the task force's work, to make this digestible, we separated the work down into 3 work streams. And I'm only going to talk about work stream 3 today, but it seemed a bit incongruous not at least to share with you what else we've been looking at. These have all been co-led by different members of the task force. So work stream 1 was looking at the deep people issues, and that was really about understanding what older people want, as well as what older people need. To think about how they get information and advice and advocacy, and how they make decisions, and how we can facilitate that in terms of meeting their housing needs. We considered issues around diversity, both in terms of protected characteristics, the specific issues around dementia, and making sure that we've got a provision in future that meets different needs and preferences according to the different preferences of the older people themselves. And then finally, in this area, we looked at the whole interrelationship between housing, health, and social care. One of my bugbears is that most integrated care systems and integrated care boards don't take housing half as seriously as they should. And that is something that we will speak into as a task force, because we recognise that the lack of join up is really damaging us as a nation in terms of facilitating high quality housing schemes. Next slide. The second work stream was around the product itself, the house, the home. And so we've looked at areas of how you support people to be healthy in their own homes. So how do you deal with both avoiding falls, but also in terms of dealing with falls when they happen. The whole area about use of technology and smart housing. We've looked at how the building regulation system works, design, accessibility. We'll be speaking into those issues. Unsurprisingly, we've looked at issues of customer protection and how we can build consumer confidence in, let's face it, a sector that lacks consumer confidence for a whole number of reasons. And then we've looked at affordability and how consumers finance their accession into these types of home, given the very different structure with respect to pricing, whether ownership or rent, service charges, and so on, and how the financial product market needs to adapt and develop to meet that different equation. Next slide. But this is where I've been really focused in terms of work stream 3, which is about places. So we've done a lot of work on how we plan, how we assess need, and how we ensure that that need is then delivered through the planning system, through site assembly, and also through ensuring that the capital markets are working effectively in terms of being able to fund this type of development. We've looked at the competition that these types of development face, not least from general needs housing, and how you protect more specialist older people's housing to ensure that it doesn't get crowded out with respect to the marketplace. Unsurprisingly, we've looked at design and how we create age-friendly places, because it's all very well building the right product, but if it isn't in a context where actually people can access the facilities and amenities that they need, and when they may also have limited mobility, then you're not going to get too far, either in terms of the marketability of the product or the experience of it as a livable environment. And then finally, and I'm not going to talk particularly about this today, we've done a lot of work on investment, fiscal measures, public-private partnerships, and all of those things that you would probably expect in terms of lubricating the market in this space. Next slide. So what is the evidence telling us? Well, I'm afraid it's not good news. In fact, it's very bad news. The bit you all will know is that need is increasing, and it is increasing very fast. And the reality is that our ratio of older people to working age people is declining very fast as well. We're nowhere near where, for example, they are in South Korea now, where that ratio is set to fall below 1. But nevertheless, if we do not create homes and environments in which older people can both support themselves, support each other, and get the right care that they will need, we are going to end up in a very bad place as a nation, not least in terms of the impact on an already overstretched NHS and social care system. This is an area on which we can't afford to fail. It is also, therefore, why the government does deserve credit for actually setting up this task force and also doing it on a bilateral basis between DesHCA and DLUC, i.e. 2 government departments, 2 ministers co-sponsoring this. And the reality is that once we've made our recommendations, any oversight of delivery will be down to those 2 departments continuing to be able to join up and make further progress. The second piece of bad news is that while demand and need is going up, supply is drastically failing to keep pace. And at a time when we should be accelerating in terms of more older people's housing being built, actually we're building less. And there are all sorts of worrying signs, some in terms of planning and the number of planning permissions that are being granted or not, as the case may be. And we particularly have a problem around larger developments, which is a real problem because viability dictates that actually you need quite a lot of these developments to be quite large, as well as also providing the ancillary facilities that make these places more livable. So we've got a real problem there. But there's also, as well as the planning deficit, there is also an issue, I think, around the care deficit as well. There's many housing associations that at the present time are withdrawing from this market, which is also a real problem. And the reality is that they're withdrawing, not because of the housing costs, but because of the lack of certainty in terms of the care support and the care costs being there when they're going to need them in terms of the particular residents and tenants, that lack of join-up that I talked about previously. Next slide. So in summary, why are we failing? And I'm now particularly focusing on the planning system. So the first is that we found unbelievable level of inconsistency and variation between local planning authorities in just how seriously they take older people's housing, from not seriously at all, or even at all, right through to the likes of North Yorkshire, who take it incredibly seriously and plan accordingly. What we found was that most local authorities don't have a clear view on future need, haven't properly mapped it, haven't properly segmented it, and therefore don't know what they're aiming for in terms of planning provision. And also, from even beyond that, having cogent and intelligent planning policies that would deliver that need. In fact, around a third of local plans haven't got any specific policy for older people housing in their plans, and even fewer than that make specific allocations of land for older people's housing. So we've got a problem at the local level. But then the national level doesn't help us very much either, because the national planning guidance, the NPPG, is so wishy-washy in terms of what it expects local planning authorities to do or not do, that it lets those that choose to do very little pretty much off scot-free by the time they get to the examination in public and the inspection of their plan. And even when you've got the plan in place, the planning system doesn't work very well in terms of these developments. There is utmost confusion around where most of these developments fit in terms of the use classes order, with planning authorities themselves seemingly very confused as to whether individual developments fit within C2 or C3 uses, creating more uncertainty in the market. And if there's one thing the market dislikes intensely in terms of capital allocation, it is uncertainty, because it adds time to projects and it adds cash costs as well. I already talked about the lack of join-up between housing, health and care. That directly impacts on viability and assessments of viability. But beyond that, local planning authorities themselves tend not to understand the specific demands of viability for these types of scheme, loading onto them costs around affordable housing and infrastructure levies that just can't be borne the weight of by schemes that have such long lead times and such high initial development costs not least in terms of providing the ancillary facilities that these schemes need. Next slide. So what does good look like? So I want to tell you what I think at the end of the task force's work, a high-performing local system looks like. I don't think there is actually a single system in the country that I would tick every box here, but there are some that do this far, far better than others. So the first is a good practice authority or a good practice system will have a clear understanding of types and numbers of accommodation required, segmented and translated into a very clear future provision map that thinks about individual geographies, placemaking, and so on. It will back this up, this needs analysis, with really clear local plan policies that facilitate the delivery of different types of older people's accommodation. As a planning authority and within the local plan, it will have designated and protected site opportunities for older people's housing and back that up by use of land assembly where that is required to ensure that there is a sufficient supply of land. It will have recognised that actually there is a real opportunity for mixed use and mixed tenure communities by actually including a requirement for specialist provision on larger strategic sites. So it doesn't just end up as a desert of general needs housing, but actually you can build older people's accommodation very successfully into those larger schemes if house builders are told that they must do so. And that is protected through the planning system. There has to be the development of long-term and trusted relationships with the specialist developers and the providers, including the housing associations, so that there is a future pipeline of sites for delivery. One of the critical factors, I might even say this is the most critical at the end of the task force's work, in my opinion, is those local systems that were being by far the most successful had a dedicated team. Didn't have to be a large team, but they had a shared team that went across as a minimum housing, estates, i.e. land, and care, charged collectively with delivering a pipeline of development against plan. Good local planning authorities have a realism and an understanding and expertise around viability in this specific space, and therefore they set conditions, Section 106, etc., accordingly in a way that is realistic, recognising that there are wider benefits, not least in terms of reduced health and care demand, if you get this right. Good planning for local authorities, local systems are flexible with respect to tenure mix on these sites and ancillary facilities to reflect the different viability equations in different geographies. What's going to work in Stoke-on-Trent is not the same is going to work in Richmond. And therefore, you have to adapt your policies and your approaches accordingly. A good local authority, local system will be doing some really solid work around overall place design to make sure that there are age-friendly communities for these developments to go into. So it'll be impacting wider urban design, public realm improvements, bus planning, and so on. And finally, good systems will be using their broader statutory care and continuing healthcare responsibilities to actually provide guarantees levels of income for these developments through nomination rights or some alternative approach that actually gives these schemes ballast because they know they've got a certain level of tenants, certain level of residents before they even put a spade in the ground. Final slide. So as we head towards our final report, these are the key questions that we as a task force are going to answer. We're going to answer the question, what do we need from national government? At the very least, that's going to be a lot better guidance, a lot clearer guidance, so we can drive greater consistency within the system. Which brings me on to the second question. How do we ensure greater consistency of planning and performance from local planning authorities? How do we have more authorities ticking most of the boxes in terms of that good practice digest? And that has to come down to some degree of stick and carrot. And I think the report will talk about what those sticks and carrots might be. How do we make it easier to secure planning consent for older people's housing schemes? How do we ensure they're not crowded out, but actually the opposite? They're actually more attractive for developers to pursue, in some cases even than general needs housing. How do we facilitate viability, not just through the planning system, but partially through the planning system, and therefore secure greater deliverability? What are the consequences if planning authorities fail to meet need? What happens then? What does that mean in terms of windfall sites and those that are outside the local plan? How do we ensure better placemaking and product design? What's the role of design codes? Is there a role for the Office for Place as examples of questions? And finally, and more broadly, what is the role of the relevant national bodies to facilitate success? That would include, of course, HousingLIN, but I'm thinking particularly here of Homes England and their role, not just within the affordable sector, but actually potentially acting as a champion and a facilitator more broadly within this space, so that we have a successful market, mixed, affordable and private, going forward, that gets us somewhere close to the huge increase in numbers of older people's accommodation that we require. Thank you very much.
Sorry, coming off you. So, John, thank you very much. I mean, fascinating insight. I'm sure you have absolutely pushed to the limits what Julian Meyer was going to let you say. Lots of insight there, and particularly for me, thinking about the emotional implications that I talked about before and how the planning system is so central to a lot of those. So thank you very much. I'm going to move swiftly on to our next two speakers. So Alison Bowes and Kate Pemble. So Professor Alison Bowes is Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Professor in Sociology at the University of Stirling. And she has a long-term interest in dementia and design for later life. Over the last 3 years, Alison has been the principal investigator for the Healthy Aging Challenge research project on the design of homes for healthy cognitive aging. And Kate is the Research Impact Fellow on that project. Kate has, again, a longer-term interest in dementia and disability with a background in health and social care. So, over to you, Kate, to get us started.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Hopefully folks can see and hear me. I am here today as the last act of the Designing Homes for Healthy Cognitive Aging project. It officially wraps up today. Doesn't mean you'll get rid of us, it just means we're not actively pulling in data anymore. So the Designing Homes for Healthy Cognitive Aging project was indeed funded as part of the Healthy Aging Challenge, and its core mission was to identify the practical, affordable, sustainable solutions that were going to make it possible for people to remain in their chosen homes and their chosen communities for longer. Now, I'm presenting this today, but it is a work of multitudes. I've put some, but not even all of us on this slide. So a great thanks to everybody involved. Now, just to give some visuals here to make sure we're all on the same page, DesHCA was part of an ambitious project, and the Healthy Aging Challenge is really ambitious, and it's really necessary for a couple of reasons. One of them being, and I like to visualize this because I'm not a numbers person, that nearly 24.8%, nearly 25% of us will be over the age of 65 in 2050, with 3.6 million of that, give or take, over the age of 85. Now, approximately 1 in 3 people will then be living with a long-term health condition that significantly impacts them by the time they reach 75, so within sort of 10 years of that. And that's really, really important, because we know from our research and the research of others that only about 10% of UK houses are adapted in any way to accommodate any sort of disability, any sort of impairment. We know that approximately 90% of those adaptations that are installed are in the bathroom. So that's a really, really limited place for that kind of adaptation to happen. And we know that people who are living with dementia, who have a confirmed diagnosis of dementia, are still 3 times more likely to receive an adaptation that's focused on their mobility than one that's focused on their cognitive needs or their sensory needs. So that's a really, really big scope for us to lean into, that huge number of aging populations, the fact that we are going to all have some kind of health condition as we age, pretty much, and the fact that really there's not a lot of information out there in terms of adapting for cognitive health. Now, DesHCA is a huge, huge project, we've spoken to a lot of people. About 821 people have fed into the project directly. Add on to that the 13,000 or so records that our quantitative side have used to analyse and pull out some of the data from ELSA, from the Scottish Housing Survey and so on. It looks like this. It looks like about 122 people taking part in an iterative eDelphi panel, which gave us the grounding to understand what people were already thinking about design and how design can support ageing in general, and cognitive ageing as part of that. We did 63 creative mapping interviews where we went and spoke to older people themselves about what their houses were like now, what they'd been like in the past, what they liked, what they didn't like, what they thought they were going to have to change, and what they were worried about. We installed passive sensors in 13 homes, which tracked key features like air quality and heat and humidity against activity levels to give an idea about how houses themselves are responding to the way that people are using them. We did a massive EDAT home audit, so about 331 people filled that in, which was, as far as we can tell, probably the first time that there was a major effort to get an insight into how dementia-friendly homes in the UK really are, as opposed to how dementia-friendly they should be. We interviewed 21 professionals about industry and the issues in industry and how design makes its way into how healthy cognitive design makes its way into buildings in practice. We talked to about 94 people during our VR designs. We'll talk about that a little bit going forward, but that is essentially how we brought people into the heart of design, because not everyone can read a blueprint, but most people can look through a VR or look on a screen and get an understanding of what we're talking about. We had another 49 people take part in feedback workshops to help us really navigate in and focus in on our findings. And then we did 128 people who played our serious game, which is a novel tool that we've created to help people think creatively about these issues while also breaking them out of the kind of standard way that they tend to think about these things. And that's a little bit of what we're going to be doing today. I don't have a huge amount of time, so I really am giving you a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, but here are the key issues as we see them. People, older people and professionals both have a really stigmatized and limited understanding of what age-inclusive, dementia-friendly, age-friendly design is and who can benefit from it. There's a key issue there because we end up with an idea that we don't need that stuff. That's not for me, that's for older people. And no matter what age you are, you're usually not an older person. There's somebody slightly to the left of you who's definitely an older person. There's a tendency to design and redesign homes for other people that we would not want to live in ourselves. We saw this quite a lot in our VR process where we were getting professionals into headsets, asking them that what they would and wouldn't change about our designs with the prompt of, this is a home for your future self, what would you like? And getting to the end and saying, okay, so if we made all these changes, would you live in this house? And somewhere along the way that got lost because the answer was often no, this is now a house for an older person. So if we're designing these houses for someone else and nobody wants them, what does that mean for us? There's also a lack of awareness of age-inclusive design and how it can be included in a variety of homes. They don't know how to do it, they think it's too expensive, and fundamentally they don't want it to look like their grandma's house. So let's go through these three problems. The first one, the idea that I don't need that stuff. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, we've got a really limited idea of what adaptations are for. Usually we think about mobility. The project's called Healthy Cognitive Aging, but that's not because we were focused on dementia specifically, but because usually, unless you explicitly put that in there, it gets left out. We're very used to talking about adaptations in the context of grab rails and lifts and stair lifts and ramps, everything that's mobility focused, and again, bathroom adaptations, shower chairs, things to help with going to the toilet. We're not as used to talking about the other kinds of adaptations, the more subtle and person-led adaptations, and we saw a lot of these. The way that we've come to think about this is the difference in language between change, which is the thing that you're doing it all the time. You're picking up something to make your life a little bit easier. You saw an idea about how you would design the kitchen. Next time you thought, oh, I would love a shelf that comes out of my bottom drawer so I don't have to lean in. All of those kinds of bits and pieces, the things that when you interview people aren't enough to count, they're not good enough to be adaptations. And then adaptations, which are usually the medicalized, the white PVC, you're getting them through occupational health. You're doing that kind of stuff. It's coming usually in response to a crisis. And those are generally what people don't want in their house, because that's an indication that something's gone horribly wrong. And that makes sense. But it means that our conversations about how do we make homes more inclusive have to break through that barrier, because we're not talking about everyone getting white PVC handles. What we're talking about is using these principles in every home to raise the standard. Let's go forward. I really like using participant quotes for this kind of stuff, and I think this one really highlights it. The idea that I don't want that stuff in my home. So this interview was taken from someone who was over the age of 55 herself, but was reporting back on some of the issues they'd had adapting the home for her mother, who was significantly older. And the key point I want to bring up in here is we're asking about what she's done. And she said, no, we've put handrails in and we've gone for the nice ones, the wrought iron ones, because we didn't like the PVC. And when I ask her about that, she says, so my mum's now 89. So when this was probably just before she was 79, and she didn't think she was old, and she certainly didn't want to look like she was old. She wanted her house to look nice, because there's pride in what you have, whoever you are, there's pride in what you have. And we came across this over and over and over again. There was this feeling that people did not want the house to look like something else. It had to stay being their own home, and they didn't know how to do that. The idea that it's too expensive, that okay, so if I accept that I need it, and I accept that it doesn't necessarily have to look horrendous, it's going to be really, really expensive, is another one that we have to unpick. Partly because it depends how we talk about cost. The sooner people put adaptations into their home, the better. They get longer use out of them, they potentially get multiple people using them. And when we're talking about things that reduce your risk of slips, trips and falls, we potentially reduce the risk of things like hospitalization. And we know the cost in pounds and pence for every day that somebody is delayed discharge from the hospital, let alone the impact on their health and well-being. But let's talk about this final one. We don't know how to do it. This is really, really common. Even the professionals we're talking to are generally aware of what dementia-friendly design might look like, but don't know how to apply that in practice. And we end up recreating designs we don't like. So the things that I'm showing you now are taken from our VR viewer, which is up on our website. And they highlight how easy it can be to create a cognitively supportive environment, an aging supportive environment, without it looking like people assume it has to look like. So this is our kitchen, where we're focusing on issues around contrast, making sure that the worktop contrasts with the floor and with the wall. We're including clear fronted cabinets so that people are not relying on their memory in order to be able to find plates and cups and be able to get themselves hydrated or fed, which becomes increasingly critical as you get older. We've included things like clear indicators, clear buttons and switches, which makes it easier to use, whether it's a cognitive impairment or a sensory one, which most of us will live with as we go forwards. Our vision will deteriorate to some way. We talk about things like living room design and the fact it doesn't have to look like an old person's home or a residential home. What we're asking for is chairs with strong arms and good floor coverings and plenty of storage. These are things that most people would like. And honestly, this is the 4th iteration of this design, and I would have moved in 2 iterations ago. We get pushback sometimes because these houses look too modern, or like this bedroom, they look too big. They're not feasible under our current financing structures. But here's the thing, this bedroom in particular looks massive because we've modeled this with a normal double bed. Not everyone will stay in a normal double bed forever. And the minute you need a hospital bed, and a hospital bed with perhaps a piece of equipment on the end that adds another 12 centimeters, even this room transforms from something that looks really spacious and generous and easy to move around into something where you really have just enough space to get the job done. And that again is about making sure people can go home, they can be where they want to be, and they're not sat in hospital with delayed discharge. It's about making sure that people have a really good idea about what this design can look like, what the principles do look like, and how they can apply them in ways that they like, in ways that speak to them and their home. So we can start to change from questions of, why should I do that? I don't need that yet, to, well, if I'm redoing some of my bathroom, if I'm doing my kitchen, why shouldn't I include some of these principles? Why shouldn't I do these designs? Now, while the project is wrapping up, we have put a lot of effort into our project website, which is at www.DesHCA.co.uk. And on that, we have a huge amount of information about what we've done and how we've done it, but also a really comprehensive resource section where we've taken some of our findings and started to translate them into resources people can really use. The books in the top left here are the hints and tips booklet and the checklist were asked for by older people. They wanted more accessible information that didn't speak down to them or encourage them to make essentially a mini hospital. So we made that for them. We have insights from our stats teams, we have cost benefit things, and the thing that I've helpfully put myself in front of is the viewer, where you can find the pictures we've just seen. Excitedly, coming forward, it looks like we will have a mobile demonstrator, which we'll also be able to tour and take these designs out on the road so people can really have access and see what this means in real life, what it means for them, and start to imagine what building that into their home as soon as possible might do for them. That's about all of my time, so I will wrap up now and pass it back. Thank you very much for listening, and we will be around.
Hey, thank you very much. Lots of things come to mind, but you're stigmatizing versus age inclusive, and asking that question, would you really want to be in this house? Really insightful, and I love the sort of graphics at the end that really bring to light the results of your work. So I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions on that. So we've had planning, we've had sort of, if you like, design theory. Next up, we've got James Pickard, and James is co-founder of Cartwright Pickard way back in 1997, and he's principal of their London studio. He's helped the practice develop a reputation for housing innovation with a focus on low carbon solutions, well-being and off-site construction methods, all sort of ticking boxes, if you like, in my world of research and innovation. And James is going to talk to us about some of the international research he's done with the Royal College of Art on design and plans for later life. So James, over to you.
Hello to everybody. First of all, just like to say, I'm humbled to join such a distinguished panel of speakers, and I'm very pleased to be able to share some of our findings from a 2-year research project that we've carried out. This first slide is a little bit cheeky, but we have our own conference, and Jeremy Porteous is actually speaking at that on April the 25th. It's a face-to-face conference. We're actually in person at the Building Centre, where we're going to be sharing everything from that 2 years of research. So if you could go to the next slide. And yeah, we've heard a lot of statistics, and it's really interesting to see how they're presented. But being an architect, I'm very visual, and I think this slide for me just really says it all in terms of where the growth in the UK population is going to occur. And as John Rouse has already said, if doing nothing is simply not an option. If we're building roughly 5,000 or 6,000 homes a year for people in later life, it's simply a drop in the ocean. It's nowhere near enough. And if the figures are correct, that 1 in 20 people in the US, Australia, New Zealand, for example, 1 in 20 people of retirement age live in a home specifically designed for them to grow gracefully in the UK, that figure's 1 in 200. Again, that can't stay like that. It's got to change. The NHS is paying a very heavy price for this. The next government's got to join the dots. Next slide, please. So just a quick bit, Cartwright Pickard, we're architects and designers. We also focus very much on interiors as well, the entirety of the building. And I just put this slide up because this really explains what our ethos is. I'm not going to go through it all, but it's, we're very focused on outcomes, particularly improving people's lives and health outcomes through design. If we go to the next slide, please. So we're very much new kids to the block. We're just architects. We do quite a lot of government-funded research projects, but we've only built one what you could call scheme for later living. This is a small apartment building for Octavia Housing and Care. It's actually in Kensington, but on the ground and first floor, we've got intergenerational communal facilities. So young people and school kids have got activities often shared with the older residents and older people in the wider community. This was really a test bed for us to see how intergenerational activities would work. And I have to say, it's been a raging success. And if you speak to Octavia, they'll tell you that the generations thrive off talking to each other. And this siloing of different generations is unhealthy. So we've learned that from our research. Next slide, please. So we've carried out a knowledge transfer partnership, part funded by Innovate UK and our own practice. Our principal research partner was the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design at the Royal College of Art, and they've been heavily involved for the 2.5 years with us. We had a full-time PhD researcher from the Helen Hamlin Centre, and it's taken just over 2 years to carry out the research. I'm not going to share it all with you. It's all going to be shared at our conference. Anyone that attends that conference will be able to download the full research in a digital publication that we're going to make available. We evaluated over 50 projects globally, having started reading everything there was to read in the UK, looking at a lot of the best UK projects. We felt that was just too much to learn by looking away from the UK. We're a very small island, and it's easy to believe that we've got all the answers, and we know we don't. So we started with a long list of 50 projects, and then we narrowed that down to 13 globally that we visited all over the world, which I'll come on to. And the conference is going to disseminate all of those findings. If we go to the next slide, please. Yes, so our partners include Link City, ABB, the technology and electricity company, McCarthy and Stone and Cud Bentley, all contributed funding to help oil the wheels and enable the research to do what it did. And then we had an advisory panel, including Abdul Ravat, Samantha Rowland, and of course, Jeremy Porteous, who gave us, every couple of months, we had a reporting meeting, and they gave us a lot of guidance and helped us be really focused in our research. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this slide is just illustrating how far we went. We got to New York, we got to Taiwan, Australia, but a large number of projects in Europe, particularly the Nordics, and a few in the UK. But an enormous wealth of information. And it's quite interesting that Kate's presentation said that 85% of older adults prefer to stay at home, even when they've got dementia. And I think we've got to ask the question, why is that? Why would you want to stay in a home which isn't suitable for you, full of trip hazards, where you can't work out where things are and you've got no real day-to-day support? And I think we came to the same conclusion that Kate, that there's a huge sense of stigma with moving into homes for later living in the UK. You know, phrases like it's God's waiting room were often quoted to us. People want to avoid that at all costs. Now, we found that stigma doesn't exist in the same way to any degree in many other cultures and countries around the world. So, and we do think that design and placemaking has a lot to do with that. We understand that the management and operation of facilities, whether it's care homes or homes for later living with independent living provided, that the management and operation of those facilities is arguably more important than design. We recognise that. You can have the best designed facility in the world, but if it's not managed and operated well, it's going to fail. So with that in mind, we wanted to focus very much on what worked design-wise. If you could go to the next slide, please. So we've looked at inclusive design principles, which is a forte of the Helen Hamlin Centre, of course. That's its big focus, inclusive design for ageing. And their experts have helped us as architects really, with laser guidance, if you like, focus on how to dissect design, architecture, placemaking, urban design, with this in mind. I'm not going to go through all of the points listed there. There are many more, but I think it's given us as designers a really, really interesting outlook that otherwise generally architects simply don't have. Next slide, please. So what did we do when we visited the buildings? We also carried out quite extensive research. We met the developers, we met the operators, we met residents, we met staff and the architects. So we really drilled down and got some incredibly granular, valuable data and information about what works, what doesn't work, So it's a rich seam of information that we're eager to share at our conference in April. Next slide, please. So these are just a quick picture of some of the projects. If you go to the next slide, just trying to keep an eye on the clock. Yeah, so it shows you there's a real varied number of projects. And what's interesting is that they look nothing like most of the schemes you see in the UK, nothing like it. And that was what was so refreshing, to take the old blinkers off and consider doing it quite radically differently. Next slide, please. So actually, this is a scheme in the UK for Pegasus Live, designed by RCKA for the over 60s. It is about 38 apartments in Horsley in Seaford, which is basically the south coast of the UK, East Sussex. And the really special thing about this project, just to pick it out, is this beautiful winter garden / walkway, access way to get to the apartments. They've turned the circulation space into a meeting place where you can sit and have your cup of tea and meet one of your neighbours walking past. Hopefully you can see from those images. If we go to the next slide, we got some lovely feedback from residents talking about how the design encourages a sense of community. And so you're much less likely to feel isolated and lonely, which we know is one of the worst aspects of growing old. And everything about this design, which is obviously really forward-looking in its own right, but it encourages the serendipitous meetings of neighbours. You might pass somebody sitting outside in the sun or whatever in the winter garden. Some beautiful aspects of this project that we found in other projects as well. Next slide, please. Just keeping an eye on the 10 minutes that I've got. So this project in Denmark is 76 apartments, fully modular, so uses modular technology, and I think there were 3 modules which created the 1 and the 2 bed apartments, and they're all constructed around this shared atrium. It's called Agora Verni, and the Agora comes obviously from the Latin or ancient Latin word for meeting place. But essentially that winter garden space and the landscape, if you go to the next slide, the landscape within it creates such a wonderful sense of place and sense of belonging. And some of the residents there were relatively young. They were in their mid-60s compared to the UK. And we asked them, why have you moved here? And they just said, well, look around. Why wouldn't you want to move here? You know, it's in the Nordics, so that covered winter garden space creates an outdoor space you can use all year round. And it encourages socialization, and there's very little chance to be lonely, but you've got your privacy, your privacy if you want it. I think if we go to the next slide, please. So this scheme in Denmark, again, all of these projects are all in urban areas, and we do feel that the way of the future is for as many as possible homes for later life to be in urban areas close to high streets where all the amenities are. The most important thing is that closeness to amenities and public transport. Care workers and your grandkids don't always have a car. So how are they going to get to you if you're out in the sticks? So this project was totally intergenerational. There was housing, general needs housing, there was housing for students, and housing for people in later life. They shared a lot of communal facilities, including these greenhouses on the roofs. If you go to the next slide, hopefully might show a bit more on them. So, and what again was interesting was the reason people wanted to move here was the amount of daylight, the views. Too many of the schemes we found in the UK had very small windows. They're very dark and dingy. You have the lights on all the time. And the psychological impact of lots of daylight has a massive impact, particularly as older people spend a lot of time indoors. But those greenhouses on the roof are used for all sorts of different communal uses. You can have your dinner in it, you can have parties in them, and everybody talked about how they brought the community together. There was a bar on the ground floor, students could join them, and some of the residents said they even moved there because of the youthful impact that the students had. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this scheme in Adelaide by U City, designed by Woods Bagot, was a vertical integrated, they call it extreme mixed use. So basically at the ground level, you have full public access, restaurant, the shops, market, etc. on the ground floor. And then on the first floor, the U City's offices, there was a health centre, full public access, probably up the first 4 floors. Above that, the middle segment, or the next segment of 4 or 5 stories, was a commercial office, which was leased to a firm of commercial solicitors. And everybody loved it because they had the money to pay for the Christmas drinks every year, the Christmas party. The next sort of slither of 4 or 5 stories is a hotel, but with a specific slant to people with disabilities, because in Australia we understood that they don't have this rule in the UK that 10% of hotel bedrooms have to be accessible. So this had a particular focus, and it also provided for long and short rental. And then the top 6 floors provided about 42 apartments for later living, all for sale. And the residents up there loved it because of the views. And again, when you ask them why they moved from the sticks, the suburbs, into the main drag of Adelaide, they said, well, pointed out the window, there's the theatre, there's the main market, that street's got all the restaurants on, there's a bus stop outside, our grandkids can get to us. What more do you want? And the apartments didn't feel like, there was no stigma to the design of those apartments. They're beautiful. So there's nothing like this in the UK, but we found this type of building around the world, and we think it's going to be a fantastic solution, particularly high density urban situations. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this shows the same building. That's a view at the top there with the entrance there. You walk into this building, you walk through a bar, restaurant, there's a piano. It feels nothing like entering a later living scheme. And there's a terrace there. There's a lovely communal lounge area for the residents of the later living element of the building with a roof terrace. They have parties there. It's just a thriving community. Next slide, please. So I think I've taken my 10 minutes, probably a bit more. So again, cheekily, I've just put that up to try and plug our conference. If anybody would like to come, please scan the QR code there, and if you put that code in, there's a 10% discount. It's a not-for-profit conference, but we have to cover the cost of the venue and lunches, etc., etc. But hopefully, some of the people attending this conference might be interested in coming along and finding out the full version, and we'll be able to download our research in full. Thank you very much.
Sorry, my mute button not working. So James, thank you very much. I mean, that as a sort of narrative arc from John on planning, sort of Kate sort of looking at researching the art of the possible. I think what you've highlighted is there's real hope that actually there is something different that can be done, and you've addressing not just that the need to build housing, but housing that people, I think in your words, really want to live in, with those intergenerational connections. So just to sort of bring our final speaker in then, Ian Copeman should probably need no introduction, but I'll do a little bit anyway. He's the HousingLIN's research and consultancy business lead, who's got a huge amount of experience. And I'd just say, check out his CV, not just for what he's done, but for the long list of really important work that he's been involved in, both as author and as contributor. So Ian, over to you.
Thanks very much, George. Great. So if you can just take us on a slide, Jerome, that'd be great. Let's just check I can see that. Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ian Copeman, Business Director of the HousingLIN. Some regular slides, unfortunately not some inspirational photos that we just had from James. So I'm just going to summarise to sum up today our experience of working with localities to understand the housing preferences and aspirations of older citizens, and evidence from ours and other people's research with older citizens, what this evidence has highlighted. And probably most importantly, and particularly talking to some of the things that perhaps John raised a little bit earlier, the research that we're currently undertaking to understand the housing preferences and aspirations of older people with the support of UKRI, and what we hope that evidence can be used for. So if you can just move us on again, Jerome. So over the past 7 years, probably longer than that, we work with a very large number of local authorities. So by localities, I'm talking about local authorities, but with their partners in the UK, to support them to better understand the housing preferences, aspirations, we call that needs of older people, older citizens, including in England through the Local Governments Association programme that many of you are familiar with, the Housing Advisor programme, which was particularly focused on sort of sharing the learning and knowledge with other local authorities to try and plug some of those kind of gaps in the kind of evidence base and understanding that John was referring to earlier. As part of that work over the last few years, we've used a variety of kind of primary and secondary research methods, and we've probably engaged with over 2,000 older people over that time. So built up quite a kind of understanding of what people say they want, alongside all the other kind of evidence that's available to us. And we've also used that evidence in part to shape another report that probably some of you are very familiar with, the LGA's recent report from back end of 22, early 23, which is called Housing Our Ageing Population, which was designed to kind of highlight some of the things that have cropped up today, really, just sort of, how to create kind of aspirational homes and to have a more authoritative evidence base for local authorities and their partners to use in terms of planning for an ageing population and addressing some of those kind of statistical deficits that we've seen from the last 3 speakers. So if you could just move us on again, Jerome. So what this evidence has told us is that, as you all know, older people, all of us, I'm included in that, are a very diverse cohort of people with widely differing requirements and aspirations, and that's going to influence where and how they want to live in later life. And the range of housing options and opportunities needs to reflect this diversity, but as we've heard, at the moment, this is often not the case. And whilst the majority of older people often tell us, and we've seen this in some of the slides, that they prefer to remain living in their existing homes, and there might be a whole range of reasons why people do that, as well as not perhaps appreciating what some of the alternatives are. And that might be with the kind of adaptations that we've heard about today. We know that, other older people, maybe not a majority, but a significant minority, are very interested in a move to some kind of alternative home that, provided it's sufficiently attractive and meets their requirements. And ours and other people's previous research is telling us that older people, whether they move or stay put, are seeking homes that adapt to their changing needs in later life to support what George referred to at the beginning, that aging in place, in a place that, you have emotional connection to, as well as providing really good quality and, importantly, affordable accommodation. You can just move us on again, Jerome. So our previous research and other research also tells us that older people are seeking a wide range of housing options and possibilities. So where people do want to move to better meet their housing requirements and needs and aspirations, what we find is that they're seeking a mix of housing possibilities. And that might mean moving to both mainstream housing, so, non-specialist, that can be adapted or indeed is just better designed to support aging in place, as well as moving to specialist. I think one of the interesting things here is this kind of line between what we call mainstream and specialist. And James was showing some very interesting examples of specialist housing that's age designated that doesn't look like it is. And what this suggests is that a comprehensive understanding of and assessment of the needs of housing for the older population should take account of all these components of our housing mix, and any approach to understanding need that is more narrowly focused on just specific parts of that mix will only provide us with a partial understanding of what's required. So Jerome, if you can just move us on again. So what's this kind of highlighted? So the evidence certainly from ours and the kind of real world experience of housing that is better suited to older people is that, as we've seen, there's often a mismatch between older persons' housing preferences and aspirations and what is typically available locally. And this problem is in significant part due to local authorities, but also housing providers and developers not necessarily having an accurate and robust evidence base of the housing requirements of older people. We heard John talking about that earlier in terms of what the task force has been looking into. both in order to influence, plan for and direct housing development better suited to requirements of older people. But we also see that there's a range of kind of, if you like, methods that seek, or methodologies that seek to identify the housing needs and requirements of older people. And these are typically based on a review and use of secondary data. And currently, these methods almost always focus on the need for specialist types of housing and perhaps not a full broad range of different housing options that people are looking for, of which specialist housing is one component. And what ours and other research with older people over the last 30 years has shown is that the solution to meeting the future housing preferences and requirements of our aging population is often complex and nuanced. So Jerome, if you can just move us on again. So we've spent quite a lot of time working with localities, local authorities and their partners, and through that they've made very clear to us, you know, what they think they need in order to address some of the gaps we've been hearing about this afternoon. And those include the need to address a gap in the current evidence base. And, you know, what they've suggested is, or what we've kind of picked up is essentially large-scale, UK-wide, comprehensive primary research with a representative sample of older people. I think it's key that it's representative, in order to derive that understanding and that evidence base that's required at a local level of the full range of housing needs, requirements and preferences that older people have for housing options in later life across all types of housing that will support aging in place. And there's particularly a need to understand or have better evidence of the future probability or propensity of older persons either to remain living in their existing homes or to move to an alternative home. What are the kind of triggers that are going to enable people to make that move if that's what they want to do, whether that's to another type of mainstream housing or to a specialist type of housing that's age designated. And what they've said to us, and what lots of partners have said to us, is that what they're looking for is for independent research that provides a consistent and reliable evidence base that can be used at both the UK level, a UK country level, but also at a local level, but with scope for local adjustments that reflect the kind of place-based variation that we obviously have across the UK, and that can be used to inform both both housing, social care planning, local plans, and local planning policy. So to fill some of those gaps we've heard about earlier today. You can move us on again, Jerome. So to address these requirements that local authorities and their partners have got with the support of UKRI, and you know, we've worked very closely with them on this and really welcome their support. It's been pivotal. We're now undertaking much larger scale primary research to provide this comprehensive and accurate UK evidence based on that representative sample of the older population, on which we can then have an evidence base to plan for and deliver the housing and accommodation choices sought and required by older people. So this involves a survey of a representative sample of people aged 50 plus in the UK. This is designed to elicit the current and future housing preferences of this cohort and their propensity and likelihood of moving to different types of housing or indeed staying put. And the key thing here is that we've got a sample size that is sufficiently robust. So you know, our intention was that we would survey at least 3,500 people, which is the minimum we need at 50 plus for it to be representative. We've actually sampled considerably more than that. So 5,500 people is the sample size that we've used. So this is hopefully more than representative of the distribution of the 50 plus population across all 4 UK nations as well. And the requirement for having this sample size was that the evidence is robust, it has reliability and validity, it provides comprehensive evidence of people's housing preferences, and it provides, importantly, sufficient data for modelling the likelihood of older people moving or staying put in the future, with the opportunity to kind of build in kind of factors that some of the things that we've seen today that, you know, people might be choosing to stay put because they're just not aware of what the alternatives are or what they could be. So just to finalise before we move on to the Q&A session, if you could just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. We will publish the findings from this research in the spring, so a little bit further on from where we are now. I'm guessing that's probably April, May time, and that'll be through a series of dissemination events. I'm hopeful that some of those will be in person as well as online. And most importantly, we're going to use the findings from that research as a basis for a primary research-driven approach to understanding of housing needs and preferences of older people for use by local authorities. So effectively a new kind of modelling tool that's based on this up-to-date evidence base. We're currently working with a group of local authorities about how they can use how we can use these research findings to model and create that kind of evidence base, but in a way that they can use that with kind of local sensitivity and that can reflect their kind of local place-based circumstances and the kind of variations that they have in terms of tenure mix, socioeconomic background, and the health needs of people from different cohorts. And we'll also obviously be seeking to engage with a much wider range of stakeholders in relation to the research findings and the potential that they give us and what we can use them for. So thanks very much for inviting me to speak this afternoon. And I'll now hand back to George for the broader Q&A session. Thank you.
Ian, thank you very much. And you brought us sort of on a full arc back to planning, but that need for really good independent evidence base to actually inform those planning processes. So thank you for that. For the audience, do please, if you've got more questions, do put them in the Q&A on chat. I know there's a couple. I'm going to get to those in a minute. I'm going to start off probably for a question for James and then John. We're living through a cost of living so-called crisis, but certainly times of higher inflation. We've heard lots of really inspiring stuff about what can be done. What gives you hope that this is actually realistic for low and middle income dwellings for the UK?
Who would you like?
James, I mean, if you kick off, and then maybe John can come in afterwards. Yeah.
I mean, the schemes that we visited, most of them, I would argue, are affordable in the sense that they would be deliverable in the UK for certainly the middle income, middle cohort. You've obviously got the very low income end of the market, and you've got the very high end that we don't need to worry about, the swimming pools, etc., etc. But for that middle cohort, which is by far the majority, the very largest element of the population, I think none of the schemes that we visited had very high rent. Perhaps the New York one was probably at the top end, but the rest of the schemes were, I would say, deliverable within sensible UK construction budgets. So I think there is an issue to do with the size. There's a sort of minimum size to support 24/7 site presence or whatever, and the shared facilities. But I think if there are ways of generating additional revenue or income from, say, a private restaurant that might be incorporated into the scheme, and the ability to have footfall, i.e. be on a high street or close to a high street, tends to drive the vibrancy of a location, and that then can support other interesting elements that could perhaps be on the ground floor, maybe a bit on the first floor of a scheme. So I'm very hopeful that we just need a slightly different mindset in the UK, I think, about mixed use and also intergenerational living. Perhaps elements of sites could have student living on general needs housing, affordable housing, and later living. And it's the siloing that I think isn't ideal. And there's absolutely no reason why you can't convert existing buildings like department stores on high streets and all these. 20% of high streets are vacant at the moment. Get the grey pound onto the high streets got to be a really sensible thing for us to be doing. So I'm very hopeful, yes.
Oh, good. Well, that would be music to the ears from Judith Phillips, who's also sort of funded some work on retail and older population. So, John, your thoughts?
Yes, but I think is in terms of optimism. So first of all, I think we have to recognise that generally we're going through a period at which getting any residential developments away outside certain geographies is difficult because of the relatively high inflation, high interest rate environment in which we're currently operating. But we have to assume that there will be some degree of normalisation at some stage, which gets the value to construction cost gap down back to reasonable levels. And that's affecting all housing, not just older people's housing. So just putting that to one side, it's about giving older people's housing a fair whip, a fair chance, which means you've got to give the sector a degree of protection. And that means, making sites available, particularly from the one public estate type perspective, being realistic about the land values that you're going to get from some of those sites. It does mean, I think, Homes England having a broader canvas in terms of being able to facilitate how these developments get away. The biggest issue the private sector faces is not the long-term viability of these schemes, it's the bridging, because these schemes take longer typically to develop, and therefore longer to generate an income to offset your borrowing, your construction costs, and so on. And so I think we've got to think cleverly about how we enable those schemes to bridge that gap. And I don't think that can be beyond the wit of us, particularly around public-private partnership.
Good. No, so that lots for your task force report, but actually reasons for hope. Actually, going from the big to the sort of more straightforward, it was a question in from Janet Sutherland that actually both relates to what you were saying, Kate and Alison, but perhaps also the role of the HousingLIN, which is how can people find out what they ought to be doing when they get presented with individual choices? Where's the information coming from?
That's a great question, and it's a huge issue. What we found across stakeholder types, so whether we were working with older people, whether we were interviewing industry professionals in design and architecture or social care, whoever, there is a real lack of information available. We've done a certain amount on our website to try and make that more accessible to people, and we're hoping that that will kind of prompt a little bit more activity going forward as well. But it's really difficult. We obviously always point towards our partners over at the Dementia Services Development Centre at the DSDC. Obviously, their focus is dementia specific, but a lot of the kind of advice that they can give is applicable to a lot of different kinds of cognitive issues, which is particularly important when we're now talking about people living with long COVID and people living with dementia for longer and so on and so forth. But it's not, I think the key thing here is it's not that people aren't looking in the right place, is that a lot of the time this information hasn't existed, or it's being given out on a case-by-case basis in little silos. So we're talking, and we're bad about this in research, we're talking about people as if they only have one thing going on in their life at a time. So if you have dementia, you get a dementia diagnosis, you might get advice about dementia. But if you happen to have dementia and sight loss, or dementia and an issue with mobility, then you tend to be handed these bits and pieces. And it's about, I think, creating a much more holistic view of aging and recognizing that for most of us, if we're lucky enough to live long enough, we'll have a little bit of a lot of these things in play. And it's about future-proofing our homes to kind of lay our best bets down.
Right, and then maybe if you could come in not so much on the topic you've talked about. So James and John's question was very much about new build, but how do we get the sort of insight and the information to people who are responsible for maintaining the huge existing housing stock? Or maybe that's Jeremy coming in, is it? I think you're still on mute.
I just wanted to come in on the information advice piece. John highlighted that was one of the core strands of the task force, and indeed John Galvin, who's a co-lead for that, unfortunately he's just dropped off the delegate, but he and Catherine Smith at Sky Social Care Institute Excellent really see this as a central pillar of a number of strands that we're taking forward in the task force, both information advice, but also advocacy, so that people's views can be both accessed and being made aware, but also their views represented. And a core component is really about how we co-produce this with local community. So that place-based locality needs to engage with advice information services as well.
Good, no, thank you. So there's quite a specific question from Lynn Collingbourne for John, but actually might be quite interesting for a lot of people to hear. Do you know of any local planning authorities that have successful policies requiring housing with care as opposed to residential care and full wheelchair adaptable for age restricted accommodation?
So no,
Some
I think,
good case studies there.
yeah, so the honest answer is I don't think I can point to an authority. What we tend to find, is you've got local authorities who've got really good older people's housing strategies, but they tend to be developed by the housing team or maybe the housing and adult care team. So Calderdale's, for example, is excellent. Really, really good strategy if you look it up on the web. North Yorkshire I've already mentioned. Sunderland will be another, but they're not actually driven by the local planning authority. So even in those best practice authorities, there isn't necessarily the translation of the strategic intent into land use planning policies, which makes it less likely that they will be implemented consistently over a period of time. So I'm sorry to be, a disappointment in that respect, but I think that is the truth of the situation, that even the best practice authorities haven't necessarily properly translated their strategies into planning policies.
Good, thank you.
Quickly come in, George. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the task force is really interested in looking at this and have been looking at design both in terms of Part M42 and M43. The only authorities that I'm aware of are the GLA, who've got a stated planning policy requirement around 90% M42 and 10% M43, and the GM, Greater Manchester, now looking at that as well. But it's not universal across England, and some of the work in Scotland and Wales is slightly more advanced.
No, thank you, Jeremy. And another question from Abdul Rahman. We've talked a lot about the Housing Task Force policy, planning, and all the rest of it. His sort of question was, what are the carrots and sticks that would need to come forward to get more general providers to build more older person provision? And I suppose, Ian, I sort of direct this to you in the first instance. So we've heard about the planning side of it. How do we encourage people to want to actually come to their planning authorities already with those sorts of things? And does your sort of work on generating evidence actually have an outlet in that direction as well?
I think it probably is the other way around. So it's kind of tying back in with what John said in the beginning of his presentation about that. What we see is that local authorities that do have a clear evidence base, and they've set out that very clearly, both to registered providers of social housing, but also to market providers, and particularly to housing providers, and not just kind of specialist providers, are the ones that are more likely to get those propositions coming forward. Tying in with the previous question about local authorities that have turned their kind of demand analysis into a planning policy statement, there are a couple that we're aware of, relatively small. Telford and Wrekin in the West Midlands have done that from a planning policy perspective, and also Gateshead in the northeast of England. And I don't have the links to hand, but we'll put those in. We'll put them somewhere so that people can come back to that and find those, because they're on the web and people can look at those. So our experience is that sort of approach, and probably Central Bedfordshire is another example. I don't know whether they've turned it into planning policy, but everyone's very familiar with their kind of housing prospectus, which just simply doesn't look like a traditional public sector document whatsoever. And that's effective in our experience in attracting both conversations with specialist providers of specialist housing, both social and private, but also potentially market housing providers. We know that's a huge challenge. The mainstream house builders need a lot of persuasion that this is a kind of area that they need to take seriously, but it clearly is something that needs to happen.
Right. Kate, you'd like to come in on that?
Yeah, 100%. I'm in complete agreement with Ian on here. We did quite a bit of work talking to architects, designers, builders, etc. And a lot of what we got back was that kind of reticence. And it turned out that even where people were really invested in what we were doing, like genuinely coming from a really good place, they often kind of fell back into this assumption that what we were asking them to do was to invest more money in what they considered to be really niche or limited stock. So essentially we were only asking them to improve the situation for houses specifically designed for older people, whereas our argument is that it's entirely possible that people need to go there eventually, but in the meantime we actually need to be raising the level of all housing in general, because a home that's more accessible and is adapted for someone in later life is probably also useful. If you are earlier in your life, if you can store a walker there, you can probably store a pram. But it is that question of how we do it, and what we found is a little heartening in that as we went along, everyone was very willing and very keen to kind of drive forward this more age inclusive future. But it was always a case of, oh, you know, I would do it, and the but usually did come down to money, and it usually got pointed at a governmental level and essentially said, you know, we would do it, but it's the size that it takes, it's the requirement that it takes, we can't do it. We've done some work on that. We're feeding into the Housing for Varying Needs update in Scotland. We put into the task force, etc. But it's going to be this kind of multi-flanged move where people need to know what they want and ask for it to drive demand. Suppliers need to know how to build it, and then there's going to have to be legislation and guidance that pushes from the other end as well in order to actually move this one forward, because it's such a tricky process.
Good. And I see James just put a comment in with a phrase lifetime homes, and I'm sort of reminded by work of the University of Newcastle on intergenerational kitchens, and getting into that idea of when do people modify their homes, when do they buy those things. I suppose again a question back to you and Alison. We've talked about house builders, but how much have you been able to engage with the market of well-known brands of sort of stores that do sort of home refurbishment, home redecorating, and all the rest of it, to get your ideas into the mainstream psyche of people who are going through that process before they realize they have a cognitive impairment issue?
So the answer is two-sided. On one hand, we're really lucky because we actually had people like IKEA and like Robertson's the Builders and Faithful and Gold as partners on the project. So we had that insight from industry, from retail, from practice, from the get-go. But what we've actually ended up focusing on more is putting out and explaining general principles, because at its core, there could be no product or product line that we could ever endorse that wouldn't immediately be out of time as we went forward. Or alternatively, the minute you call something dementia friendly or disability friendly, it gets that tax added on the top, it becomes more expensive. It's much more useful, we've found, to show people, you know, we're talking about contrast. We're talking about, hey, it'd be really useful if your toilet seat contrasts with the color of the toilet bowl and the floor. If you want that to be a bright purple toilet seat, I don't necessarily understand your choices, but I support them as long as your floor is not also bright purple. It's about giving people the opportunity to shop in the normal market with the information to create from that a home, instead of putting them into specialty products that then potentially cost more.
Good, lovely, thank you. I think we're going to be saved by the bell. I'm going to have to bring this to an end. So I hope everyone would sort of join me in thanking sort of John, Alison, Kate, James, and Ian for an absolutely fabulous sort of session on the Festival of Ideas. So thank you very much.
And George, on behalf of the HousingLIN, can we also thank you for chairing it so eloquently as well, and your contributions and sponsoring this session. And we look forward to promoting it and issuing the recordings early next week. If you found today's session of any interest, a couple of the issues will be focusing tomorrow morning. We're looking at collaborative models of housing and care, which touch on some of the sort of softer things that John and James and Kate sort of drew attention to, from co-housing through to the health and housing links in terms of the health dividend of better quality housing. And we conclude tomorrow afternoon with Lord Best, who's chairing the final session, which is going to look at inclusive design in a bit more detail, drawing on some UKRI funded work with Invisible Creations, some work with Dr. Vicky McCall from Stirling University as well, and the work of Johnny Johnson Housing too. So please do join us tomorrow afternoon as well for our final sessions if you haven't already signed up. But on behalf of the LIN, please do thank all our speakers for giving up their time this afternoon. Can I thank Jerome and Sally for your support, and Alice behind the scenes. And if you'd like to be involved with the LIN in a number of ways, please do so by emailing us, either by wanting to speak or contribute to a future event, sponsor a session, or indeed want to engage with us and our consultancy team. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.